Picture this. The year is 2500 BC in the sun-scorched lands of Egypt. Human civilization is carving its legacy into stone, building monuments so grand they will endure for millennia. We look at the Great Pyramids and think of this as the dawn of our modern world, an age of pharaohs and burgeoning empires. But shift your focus and travel 8,000 kilometers to the north, into the frozen heart of the Arctic Ocean. Here, the world is different. It's a place of ice and wind, a place that feels ancient and untouched. And on a remote, fog-shrouded island, something impossible is happening. A creature we believe belongs to a lost world, a ghost of the Ice Age, is taking a breath. While the pharaohs were building their tombs, the last woolly mammoths on Earth were still alive. They were stranded on a forgotten island at the top of the world, a final, lonely outpost, clinging to existence for thousands of years after their kind had vanished from everywhere else. This is not just the story of how they survived. It's the story of the strange, genetic mystery that finally brought them to their knees. To understand the miracle of Wrangel Island, you first have to understand the catastrophe that created it. Let's rewind the clock to the end of the last great ice age, around 12,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, the world had belonged to giants. Herds of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, and cave lions roamed vast, grassy plains that stretched across the northern hemisphere. This was their kingdom, the Mammoth Steppe. But their world was ending. The planet was warming up, and the colossal ice sheets that had locked up so much of the world's water began to melt. This wasn't a gentle thaw. It was a dramatic, planet-torturing climate shift. The cold, dry grasslands that the mammoths depended on began to shrink, replaced by dense, wet forests and soggy tundra where their food was scarce. The giants were running out of room, and they weren't alone in this changing world. A new, clever, and highly adaptable predator was on the rise. Us, our ancestors, armed with sophisticated stone-tipped spears and cooperative hunting strategies, had become incredibly efficient at taking down megafauna. For a mammoth, a changing climate was a chronic illness, a slow decline. But a human hunting party was an acute, immediate threat. The combination was lethal. Across North America, Europe, and Asia, the great herds began to falter and then vanish. It was a mass extinction playing out in slow motion. One by one, the regional populations winked out of existence, leaving behind only bones and the fading memories we would later capture in cave paintings. By 10,000 years ago, the woolly mammoth was functionally extinct on the world's great continents. It seemed their story was over. But it wasn't. Not quite. There was one place where the Mammoth Steppe held on longer than anywhere else. A vast, now-vanished landmass known as Beringia. This wasn't the narrow land bridge we often imagine. At its peak, Beringia was a subcontinent, a sprawling, cold, and arid plain connecting what is now Siberia and Alaska. It was the heartland of the Mammoths' empire, a refuge where they could still find the grasses and sedges they needed to survive. As the world changed around them, this was their final stronghold. But the rising seas, fed by the melting glaciers, were coming for their kingdom. The water level crept higher, year after year, century after century, relentlessly swallowing the low-lying plains of Beringia from the north and south. You can imagine the scene. The great herds being squeezed into a smaller and smaller territory. Their world literally shrinking beneath their feet. They were being pushed back, fragmented, their once unified population breaking apart into isolated pockets. It must have been a time of immense stress and confusion. They were simply following the food, retreating to higher ground as the ocean advanced. Among these retreating animals was one particular group. They likely had no idea they were doing anything special. They were just moving to the hills and mountains that offered a temporary escape from the encroaching water and the changing landscape. These weren't just any hills, though. They were the highest points of the ancient Beringian Plain. And as the waters continued to rise, these highlands were about to become something else entirely, an island. The final act of this great escape was not a dramatic stampede, but a quiet, inexorable separation. Over a few hundred years, the last channels flooded. The last connections to the mainland were severed. The water closed in. That group of mammoths, which had simply sought refuge on high ground, was now trapped. They were marooned. They had unknowingly walked onto an ark that would save them from the immediate extinction that claimed their relatives on the continents, but which would also become their prison. This new home, this final sanctuary, we now call Wrangel Island. Suddenly, this small population, perhaps only a few hundred individuals, was cut off from the rest of the world. No new mammoths could get on, and they could never leave. They were alone. For the next 6,000 years, an incredible secret history played out on this remote Arctic island. While human civilization exploded across the globe, while we invented writing, built cities, and forged empires, this relic population of Ice Age giants endured. They survived the end of their world, but now they faced a new set of challenges. They had to adapt to a limited space, with limited food and, most dangerously of all, a limited gene pool. They had escaped the hunters and the changing continents. But they had traded those threats for a new, insidious enemy, one that was hidden within their own DNA. The Great Escape was over. The long, lonely siege had just begun. Life on Wrangel Island was a paradox. It was a sanctuary that had saved the mammoths from extinction. But it was also one of the harshest environments imaginable. This wasn't the vast, expansive mammoth steppe they were built for. Wrangel Island is a polar desert. For 8 months of the year, it's locked in ice and darkness, lashed by brutal winds and bone-chilling temperatures. The summers are short, cool, and foggy. A fleeting window of life where sparse vegetation, mostly hardy grasses, sedges, and flowering forbs carpets the valleys. There were no trees to speak of, and no other large herbivores to compete with. But there were also no large predators. The mammoths of Wrangel Island were safe from saber-toothed cats or cave lions. But they were in a constant battle against the elements, and, ultimately, against starvation. How do we know what their life was like? The island is a perfectly preserved crime scene. The permafrost has locked away the evidence for thousands of years, and scientists are its detectives. By studying the bones, teeth, and even the fossilized dung of these animals, they've been able to piece together the story of their long isolation. The first thing they noticed was a dramatic change in their physical form. The mammoths of Wrangel Island began to shrink. This phenomenon, known as insular dwarfism, is a common evolutionary trend for large animals confined to islands with limited resources. Being a giant requires a huge amount of food. On an island, smaller bodies are more energy efficient and have a better chance of surviving lean times. Over thousands of years, the Wrangel Island mammoths evolved to be significantly smaller than their continental ancestors, shrinking from the size of a modern African elephant to something closer to a very large cow. They were still mammoths, but they were a miniature edition, molded by the harsh reality of their island home. The evidence of their struggle and adaptation is written directly into their tusks. A mammoth's tusk grows throughout its life, adding new layers year after year, much like the rings of a tree. By analyzing the chemical isotopes in different layers of the tusks, scientists can reconstruct a mammoth's diet and health over its entire lifetime. What they found tells a fascinating story. The isotopes revealed that the Wrangel mammoths relied heavily on the fats stored in their bodies to survive the long, brutal winters. This isn't surprising for an Arctic animal. But the data also showed a significant shift in their diet compared to their Siberian ancestors. They were eating different plants, and their metabolism had likely changed to extract every possible nutrient from the sparse vegetation available. They were survivors. They had adapted their size, their diet, and their physiology to this new, constrained world. For nearly 6,000 years, this strategy worked. It's a staggering length of time. This means that a population of around 300 to 1,000 mammoths was living and breathing on this island while the Bronze Age was flourishing in the Middle East, while Stonehenge was being completed in England, and as we said, while the Egyptians were building the pyramids. It's an incredible thought, an echo of the Ice Age, persisting deep into the age of human civilization, completely unknown to the rest of the world. They were a population of ghosts, living in a lost world at the top of our own. But their extraordinary survival was masking a deep, invisible sickness that was festering within the population. A sickness born from their complete and total isolation. The biggest problem with being stranded on an island isn't just the lack of space or food, it's the lack of choice. Specifically, the lack of choice in mates. When a population is large and widespread, it has a vast and diverse gene pool. This genetic diversity acts like a well-stocked toolbox, providing the population with all the different tools it might need to adapt to new diseases, changing climates, or other environmental challenges. But the Wrangel Island mammoths didn't have a large toolbox. They started with only the genes of the few hundred individuals who were first stranded there. And for the next 6,000 years, they had no choice but to breed with each other, parents with offspring, siblings with siblings, cousins with cousins. This rampant inbreeding had a devastating consequence. In any population, there are always a few faulty or harmful genetic mutations lurking in the background. In a large population, these bad mutations are rare and usually masked by healthy copies of the same gene. But in a small, inbred population, these harmful mutations can become common very quickly. There's no fresh genetic material coming in to weed them out. The bad genes get passed down again and again, accumulating with each generation. The mammoth's genetic toolbox wasn't just small. It was slowly filling up with broken tools. For thousands of years, they were physically adapting to their island, but genetically, they were falling apart. A time bomb was ticking in their DNA, and it was about to go off. The final chapter of the Wrangel Island mammoth's story couldn't be read from their bones or their tusks. It was hidden in a much deeper, more complex code. Their DNA, in a stunning feat of scientific discovery, researchers were able to extract and sequence the entire genome of one of the last mammoths to live on the island. For comparison, they also sequenced the genome of a much older continental mammoth from 45,000 years ago. By comparing the two, they could see exactly what 40,000 years of evolution, and more importantly, 6,000 years of extreme isolation had done to the mammoth genetic code. What they found was not a story of hardy adaptation, but a story of catastrophic decay. They were witnessing, for the first time, a full genomic meltdown. Imagine your DNA is an instruction manual for building and running your body. The continental mammoth had a pristine, well-edited manual. The Wrangel Island mammoth's manual, on the other hand, was full of typos, deleted paragraphs, and nonsensical instructions. The scientists found that huge chunks of its DNA had simply been deleted. Numerous genes had been broken by mutations that stopped them from working properly. This is the smoking gun of inbreeding. With no genetic diversity, There was no way for natural selection to filter out these damaging errors. The mammoths were literally losing the instructions for how to be a healthy, functioning mammoth. It was a slow-motion genetic collapse, an extinction that was happening from the inside out. And the specific genes that were broken paint a truly bizarre and tragic picture of their final millennia. So, what exactly went wrong? The genetic evidence points to some incredibly strange problems. One of the first things scientists noticed was that a large number of genes related to the sense of smell, the olfactory receptors, were broken. To a mammoth, a sense of smell is crucial. It's how they find food, how they find mates, and how they sense danger. These last mammoths may have been walking through their world in a kind of sensory fog, unable to properly smell the flowers and plants they needed to eat. Another cluster of broken genes was related to metabolism, specifically how their bodies processed fats. This would have made it incredibly difficult for them to build up the necessary fat reserves to survive the harsh winters, no matter how much they ate during the short summer. But perhaps the strangest discovery of all was a mutation in a key gene that controls the production of keratin, the protein that makes up hair. In other animals, a similar mutation leads to a condition that gives the fur a satin look. It's smoother, shinier, and might even be translucent. It sounds almost beautiful, but for a mammoth in the Arctic, it would have been a death sentence. Their iconic, shaggy coat was their primary defense against the cold. A less dense, less insulating coat would have left them dangerously vulnerable to hypothermia. While we can't know for sure if they had glowing, satin fur, the genetic blueprint for it was there. They were becoming a shadow of their former selves, able to smell properly, unable to store energy efficiently, and potentially unable to even stay warm. Putting all this genetic evidence together, we get a haunting picture of the last mammoth population on Earth. They weren't the majestic, powerful giants of the Ice Age. They were likely a population of chronically ill animals, plagued by a host of genetic diseases. They may have suffered from digestive problems, diabetes-like conditions, and a reduced fertility rate. Male mammoths may have been infertile, as some of the broken genes were related to sperm production. They were a ghost population, staggering towards extinction under the weight of their own broken genome. They had survived the end of the Ice Age, but they were losing the biological tools needed for basic survival. This genomic meltdown is a profound lesson in conservation biology. It shows that simply having a few individuals of a species is not enough. Without genetic diversity, a population is a dead end. It loses its resilience, its ability to adapt. The mammoths were trapped in a feedback loop of decline. The smaller their population got, the more inbred they became, and the more harmful mutations they accumulated. And the more mutations they accumulated, the sicker they got, causing the population to shrink even further. They were in a genetic death spiral. They were teetering on the very edge of existence. All it would take now was one final push to send them over the edge. The end, when it came, was swift. For 6,000 years, the Wrangel Island mammoths had held on. Then, around 4,000 years ago, they vanished from the fossil record completely. The great secret of the Arctic was over. For decades, the cause of their final disappearance was a mystery. And there was one obvious suspect that scientists always look to when an ancient animal disappears. Humans. Did a new wave of hunters finally discover the island and finish off the last vulnerable population? It's a compelling theory. A small group of sickly, genetically weak animals would have been easy prey for skilled human hunters. For a long time, this was the leading hypothesis. But careful, painstaking archaeological work on the island has revealed a different story. scientists have scoured Wrangel Island for any evidence of human settlement that overlaps with the Mammoth timeline. What they found was that the first signs of human camps and hunting tools on the island date to a few hundred years after the last mammoth died. Let that sink in. We didn't do it. For once, in the long, sad story of megafauna extinction, humanity appears to have an alibi. The hunters arrived too late. The mammoths were already gone. This deepens the mystery. If it wasn't a spear that delivered the final blow, what was it? The answer seems to lie in a deadly combination: their own internal genetic weakness, and one last, unlucky roll of the climatic dice. The mammoths were a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest nudge. Their genomic meltdown had stripped them of all resilience. They had no buffer, no ability to cope with a sudden crisis. The leading theory for what happened next is a perfect storm scenario. A catastrophic weather event that, for a healthy population, might have been a tough winter, but for the Wrangel mammoths was an inescapable death sentence. The event scientists believe was the most likely culprit is something called a rain-on-snow event, or an extreme icing event. Imagine a period during the deep winter where a sudden, freak warm spell causes rain to fall instead of snow. This rain soaks the snowpack on the ground, and then the temperature plummets again into a deep freeze. The result is a thick, impenetrable sheet of solid ice that encases the entire landscape. For the mammoths, this would have been the ultimate disaster. All of their food, the dried grasses and sedges they needed to dig up from under the snow to survive the winter, would have been locked away beneath a layer of ice as hard as concrete. They would have been able to see and smell their food, but they would have been completely unable to get to it. They would have been trapped in a frozen desert with an empty pantry. This kind of extreme weather event is not unheard of in the Arctic today. For modern musk, ox, or caribou, it can be devastating, causing mass starvation. For the last mammoths, it would have been apocalyptic. A healthy mammoth from 40,000 years ago, with its efficient fat metabolism and robust constitution, might have been able to survive for a few weeks, waiting for the ice to break. But the Wrangel mammoths, with their broken genes, couldn't properly store or use their body fat. They had no reserves to fall back on. Starvation would have set in quickly and brutally. In a matter of weeks, perhaps even days, the entire population could have collapsed. It's a bleak, tragic image. The last woolly mammoth on Earth not falling to a hunter's spear in a dramatic confrontation, but slowly, quietly starving to death, surrounded by its family, on a desolate, ice-locked island at the top of the world. It was a silent, lonely end to a reign that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. The story of Wrangel Island is more than just a fascinating prehistoric mystery. It's a powerful, cautionary tale. It's a perfectly preserved natural experiment that shows what happens when a population loses its genetic diversity. It demonstrates how a species can survive for millennia, seemingly stable, all while a catastrophic weakness is growing within it. It's a lesson that is deeply relevant today, as we see countless species fragmented into small, isolated populations in parks and nature reserves, effectively creating modern-day islands. The ghosts of Wrangel Island have left us a final, chilling warning, written in their own DNA. The story of the Wrangel Island mammoths is one of the most incredible survival stories our planet has to offer. It's a story of resilience, of adaptation, and ultimately, of the invisible, inescapable laws of genetics. For 6,000 years, these giants held on, a forgotten echo of the Ice Age. While the world of humanity was being born, their story forces us to rethink our own twins, to imagine a world where the ancient and the modern coexisted, separated only by geography. But it's also a somber reminder of how fragile life can be. It shows that extinction isn't always a dramatic, sudden event. Sometimes it's a slow, quiet unraveling, a genetic meltdown that happens behind the scenes until the final, quiet collapse. Wrangel Island is a vital case study, a warning about the dangers of small, isolated populations that we see all around us today in our own conservation efforts. So, what do you think is the most incredible part of this story? The fact that mammoths were alive alongside the pyramid builders, or the tragic genetic twist that led to their end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's an amazing piece of our planet's history that deserves to be talked about. If you enjoyed this journey into our planet's deep past, consider subscribing and joining our community. We have so many more stories like this to explore together. Thanks for watching.